Let me ask you a question. Where did the deadliest tornado ever in history touch down? If you live in the United States and are familiar with our countries, you probably think it was somewhere in the middle of the country, one of those plain states. Maybe it was Kentucky or maybe it was Oklahoma. But actually, it's not really even close. The most deadly tornado ever was in Bangladesh, in which 1,300 people died. Not only that, but in the top four deadliest tornadoes ever are almost all in Bangladesh. The only exception is a very large tornado that went across several different states and was very violent. So this begs a certain question. How can something like a tornado be affected by our social environment? Why are more people dying in Bangladesh? Is it just they have worse tornadoes? Well, no. The issue in Bangladesh is that unlike our housing in the US, there's a lot of ramshackle housing built out of corrugated steel and things people find lying around. So when a tornado does hit there, a lot more people die because they don't have solid structures and walls to protect them. So this is one of the ways in which we can start to understand how the environment itself is actually very much part of our social life. So here we're briefly going to talk about the sociology of the natural world, the sociology of the environment. First, we need to think about a few key terms. First, what does it mean to talk about the environment? Uh, we look around us and we tend to think of things that are part of the supposed natural world, like trees and plants and animals. Right now during the pandemic, people are talking about how animals are flourishing and skies are clearing and nature's coming back because people are staying home. But what makes what humans do not part of the natural world? In many ways, you could see human nature as acting on and changing the natural environment. So what's part of the not human environment? Even if we think about things like um, national parks and forests, these are things that are in fact artificially created and controlled by park services. So the study of human ecology and the sociology of an environment is fundamentally an examination of the way in which humans and the natural world around them interact. But it's also important to understand, how do we think about the natural environment around us? Are we not a part of that environment? Are human beings not natural in some way? And what comes from thinking about it that way? So what are some key social issues surrounding the environment? One of these is global warming. What the global warming means is that the climate, it's now called climate change, um, the climate is slowly becoming warmer and warmer by several degrees every year. And despite the fact that we might have cool weather, weather patterns are different from the overall climate. The broader climate is actually warming fairly steadily. Why should we care about this when we're in the middle of a pandemic, when we're dealing with all these other kinds of things? Well, here we can see, those of us who live in the South, that Georgia is among those states that are going to be pretty heavily impacted by global warming already. This is if we don't. This is not if, even if we don't stop making changes, um, but um, where we are right now. Right. So here we're looking at extremely hot areas. We're going to be looking at the red areas here. It's going to be what it's showing us is that we're going to see increasing amounts of GDP or our overall wealth going towards dealing with issues from environmental warming. So we're talking about the amount of money that goes into cooling, the amount of deaths from heat waves, the decline in our productivity and our energy when it's very hot, and increasing damage in the natural environment. So all of this means we are all going to be spending more money on dealing with environmental change. Another big issue is thinking about, how do we get our food? Most of the global south, as it's known, is going to be much more severely impacted. And agricultural productivity is going to drop. Particularly, you might note in the United States, in that big middle section of our country, that doesn't look very good. So food is going to be more scarce and more expensive. Now, this map always also highlights another key issue around the environment. We might note that all those countries up in the global north, up in the green up there, we see the US and Canada, we see most of Europe, much of China. These countries are going to be less impacted by climate change. And we might note that most of those countries in the global south are also those that have been the victim of historical colonialism. So not only is something like agricultural productivity going to be an issue, but those nations who have been most exploited by white Western colonial powers are also going to be bearing the brunt of the effects of climate change. And this has led to issues around environmental justice and environmental racism. Generally speaking, this looks at inequality and power and issues of the environment. We know that, for example, most poor neighborhoods are located closer to high polluting factories and industries. The National Academy of Sciences shows us here that the inputs and outputs of different aspects of our overall economy are actually absorbed and used more by white folks, for example. So we benefit more from the things that are polluting. We white people, including myself, benefit more from these polluting, while at the same time we see that communities of color tend to have poorer air quality and live nearer to these large polluters, which means they have things like higher rates of asthma and weakened immune systems, which we're seeing lead to large amounts of death today. One thing we'll be thinking about is how do we address issues of climate change going forward.